We're now ready to conclude the course in Principles of Macroeconomics. Hopefully along the way you've learned a lot about the economy, maybe thought about the economy in ways that you haven't thought about it before, and really hopefully learned something about how the economy works. So as you read the newspaper, see articles, hear politicians discuss the economy, now you have a better background and perspective on how things work and can discern for yourself. Are they telling the truth? Are they blowing smoke? What part of this do I do I agree with, and what parts do I disagree with? The thing about macroeconomics is fundamentally it comes down to policy, economic policy, and trying to help our economy work better. There's all kinds of solutions that might make our economy work better, but underlying all that is philosophy. In other words, if you have a fundamental philosophy that you believe that government works best when it's intervening in the economy, that's an important and good thing to do, then you'd have a completely different policy prescription than if you believe that the government is perhaps too big and should be less involved in the economy, and then you might recommend a different type of policy prescription. Hopefully in this class has given you a sense of what would be the effects of maybe putting into effect your political philosophy about the size of government and its effect in the economy. In chapter 33 is really kind of a summary of all the things I really want you to learn out of the class. It's really it's the culmination of policy. What are the things that the policymakers can do to help get our economy on track and keep it on track toward economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, the things that we all know help improve our lives. A summary of all this is on page 690 to 691. It's a huge table and it seems highly complicated, but if you take a few minutes and just kind of look at the piece parts of that, it's really not all that complicated, and it's a great visual summary of everything we've done up to this point. Let's just summarize. There's two fundamental types of policy. There's fiscal policy, which is Congress and the president working to raise or lower taxes, or raising or lowering government spending. These things have effect on the macroeconomy. Hopefully you understood those things when we talked about them in chapters 29 and 30, in talking about the effects of government changes in government spending and changes in taxes on the economy. Excuse me. Then into chapters 31 and 32, you've learned about how is money created. What is money? Money is not a physical thing, although, we think of it as a physical thing, but really fundamentally money is a concept. It's what we use to exchange goods and services. And money can actually end up being many things. We have a paper dollar bill that we all recognize as money, but certainly let's say I was a dentist and you need dental work done, well, the money could be, I give you dental work, and let's say you're a farmer and you give me a side of a beef. That works, right? That's not very efficient for the economy as a whole. I'm not a dentist, and the kind of things that I can sell people don't want to buy necessarily. But fortunately, McKendree hires me, pays me money. I can go down to the grocery store and buy things. So money serves a very valuable and useful function in our society. It allows transactions to take place in an easier and faster way. Money also affects the prices of things because everything is denominated in money. The more money there is floating around, then there's potential risk of inflation. So the Federal Reserve, in monitoring our money supply, has to be mindful of its positive and negative effects of having too much money floating around. Let's go back to page 690, 691. And in particular, I want you to go back a couple more pages. On page 687, table 33.3 in your textbook. This is, in a nutshell, what happens when the Fed decides to increase or decrease the money supply. How do they do that? As you've learned in this chapter, the Fed fundamentally has 3 or 4 tools that it uses to affect the money supply. There's buying and selling bonds. They can raise the discount rate or lower it. This is the interest rate they charge banks for loans. They can affect reserve requirements, which, as you saw from money creation, affects the ability of banks to lend. And finally, they have a new tool called the auction facility where they can buy and sell bonds directly. Fundamentally, the main tool of the Fed is buying and selling government securities. When banks buy a government security, that means they have the government security, but they have to give up reserves. So now the bank can make fewer loans. On the other hand, if the bank sells government securities to the Fed, the bank now has reserves, and the bank can now lend those reserves, and that expands the money supply. So in Table 33.3, that's a summary of that. If the Fed wants to expand the money supply, it buys bonds in the marketplace, putting reserves in the hands of banks. Banks can then lend that out. What happens when the banks lend out more money? The money supply expands. As you know from supply and demand, if supply shifts to the right while demand stays the same, the price is going to go down. Well, in this case, the price we're talking about is the price of money, which is interest rates. If you expand the money supply, all other things equal, interest rates go down. Now what happens? If interest rates go down, that means consumers can borrow money more easily. Meaning if you go out and get a car loan, instead of paying 5% interest, now you're paying 4% interest. And you're maybe, I would suspect, more inclined to borrow money because the money is now cheaper to borrow. The same holds for businesses. When interest rates go down in the marketplace, it's easier for business to borrow money, and they can expand their investment spending. They can grow their businesses, buy that new delivery truck, build that new factory, buy the new machine, and so on. So lower interest rates have the effect of stimulating spending in the economy. I mean, those C and that I components of GDP, which is C, I, G, and X, by lowering interest rates, we're expanding, or at least attempting to expand, consumption and investment spending. That's all laid out on pages 690 and 691. So the idea of the Fed is changing the money supply. It's to influence aggregate demand. It's trying to move it either to the right or to the left. Expanding the money supply lowers interest rates, pushes aggregate demand to the right. If the Fed determines that inflation is more of a concern, then it's going to contract or reduce the money supply. It's going to sell bonds in the market, reducing reserves, raising interest rates, and therefore take aggregate demand and push it back to the left. That in a nutshell is what's being described on page 690 and 691. Of course, Congress and the President get into this act as well by pushing aggregate demand left to right, with changes in government spending and tax policies. And then finally, other things the government does that can affect our economy affects things on the aggregate supply side of things. By changing taxes, it affects businesses' interest in producing, and it changes their profits levels, which is going to change aggregate supply. Regulations also have the effect of doing this. Education levels have the effects of doing this. Higher productivity levels have an effect on this. And finally, the world economy has an effect on all this. So the macroeconomy is now, you kind of got the idea, is an integrated, complicated system. And we try to simplify that with models that look at pieces of that. And by putting the pieces together, we can get a general overview of this extremely complicated mechanism, but at least we got a general understanding of what's going on with it. We understand how interest rates drive consumption and investment. We understand how taxes and spending affect the macroeconomy through aggregate demand, and so on. So hopefully you've learned kind of these broad themes in this course, and as always, as you study for things, if you have questions, please shoot me an email or give me a call.